Your online application's starting to fail. It's crawling on the network just as fast as a snail. We need evented programming starting from the top. Better write some code so the world doesn't stop. With the non-blocking model, we will be just fine. Built on Google Chrome's V8 runtime. And all you need to do is write some JavaScript code and use the real-time web with Node.
You're watching Real-Time Web with Node.js, and this is level 2, where we're going to be going over events in more detail. When we talk about events, you might think about the document object model in your browser, because the DOM triggers events, and you can listen for those events. Events like click, submit, or hover. If you want to run some code when those events get triggered, you might run some jQuery, for instance, listening for a click event. And when click event is triggered, you want to run some sort of function. This code effectively attaches that function to the DOM, listening for that click event. Just like in the DOM, many objects in Node also emit events. And odds are, if they emit events, they inherit from the event emitter constructor. The net server class inherits from event emitter, and it emits the request event, as we saw in level 1. If we're reading a file and we call fsReadStream, it returns a stream which inherits from event emitter, which will emit the data event as we're reading data out of the file. Let's take a closer look at the event emitter constructor by creating our own custom event emitter. So we're going to require that class. For our custom event emitter, we're going to create a logger. So we want our logger to sometimes emit error events, warn events, and info events. And we want to be able to write listeners so we can listen for when those events occur. If we wanted to listen for the error event, we could write some code like this. So here we're saying, on the error event, run this callback. To trigger or emit the event, we call logger.emit. We specify the name of the event we want to trigger, and any additional parameters here will get passed to the listeners. And here's just another example where we log another error message. And we can call this emitter as many times as we want to emit the error event. So back in level 1, you'll remember we had a function with a request and a response. And we wanted that callback to be called every time our server emitted a request event. Here's the code that we wrote, but you might be wondering, what is going on here? How is that event getting attached? Well, we're going to go ahead and look at that a little deeper. We're going to dive into the documentation now and see what's going on under the hood. So if we look up the createServer function, we can see that it returns a new web server object. We pass as a parameter a request listener, which listens on the request event. If we look up the server documentation, we're going to see that it's an event emitter. It emits several events, one of which is the request event. And you can see here the request event passes 2 parameters to the callback, which is what we're using as our only parameter to the createServer function. If we wanted to, we could write this code in a different way. Instead of sending the callback into createServer, we could instead just create the server with no parameters and then tell the server that on the request event, call this function. This syntax is typically how you add event listeners in Node. You can listen to multiple events on an object, or you can have multiple functions that listen to the same event. Doesn't matter. For instance, if we wanted to listen to the close event on our server and call a function, we could simply write server on close and then send in a function. Well, that's it for this level. Admittedly, this is one of the shorter levels in this course, don't worry, but it's really important at this point that you understand how to work with events in Node. So, time to get to it.